Night leans over the palace like a listening ear. The lamps are few, their gold light a hush upon glazed tiles. Silk whispers along the corridor, a tide against the marble shore. A door opens without a sound, because the man who opens it has trained the hinges as carefully as he has trained himself to breathe. He is neither king nor soldier, neither priest nor poet. Yet the room he walks into contains both the king and his fate. He is unarmed, at least in the way a soldier would recognize. He carries no blade at his belt, no bow at his shoulder. He carries a ring, and with it the keys to the doors everyone else imagines are locked. He was once a child, with a voice like a bell and the sun in his eyes. That child has been folded up and placed away, like a garment too small for the man he became. Somewhere, in a jar sealed with bark and wax, a piece of him sleeps, a remnant of that boyhood, a ritual of absence. He does not think of it. He thinks instead of the emperor's breath on the other side of the screen, slow, measured, trusting. The emperor is not the only one sleeping in this palace. There are lions carved in stone who have slept for centuries. There are voices in the walls that wake to laugh when men think they have built something new. Listen. The world has a heartbeat you can hear if you know where to put your ear. In Byzantium, it thrums under mosaics where saints raise their glass hands to bless or to bind. In Delhi, it roars in the monsoon, drums upon brass bowls, and scatters the scent of wet iron and dust. In Cairo, the wind carries the prayers of sailors and thieves, and the light is so white it cuts the shadow into strips. In Beijing, the red gates are taller than the sky, and the sound is the hush of lacquered doors closing on secrets. Between these places moves a thin current, a dark river with many tributaries, a nation without a map, the empire of the unmade men. They are called many names in many tongues: court officials, chamberlains, agas and parakoimonoi, guardians of the harem and keepers of the keys. To their enemies they are monsters, to their patrons indispensable, to history a scandal of necessity. They do not beget children, they beget empires. They do not inherit, they deliver. They are given power because they can never seize a throne, and then they seize everything mercy forgets to guard. A sleeve brushes silk, a seal presses wax. A whisper bends a war toward peace or toward blood. The night is absolute for one more heartbeat. Then the screen slides aside, and the emperor opens his eyes to greet the man who orders the air he breathes. No one writes a lullaby for men like these. They live in the gaps between law and love. And when they die, their names are said like spells or like warnings. We tell their story in the tone reserved for crimes and miracles, because their lives invented a new kind of power, the governance of what the world is not meant to see.
The story begins at thresholds, at the doorways where men are remade, neither fully welcomed into the world they serve, nor fully permitted to inhabit their own. The knife is older than the nation. The blade enters the story long before palaces grow and capitals burn. It comes carrying customs, myth, and survival. In many lands, castration is a curse. In some, it is a credential. In China, once upon 1,000 years, the forbidden city wore its silence like armor. Behind vermilion doors and beneath eaves cut like waves, a world ran on rules as minute as the ridges on a jade seal. The emperor was both son of heaven and prisoner of ritual. The court, a universe of ceremony and surveillance. Eunuchs had stood in that universe since the Qin and Han, men cut to fit a role that required both closeness and constraint. They carried messages when language could not be trusted. They moved within the inner court where scholars could not walk. By the late Tang and into the Ming, their shadow lengthened until it reached the throne. In Byzantium, a city of water and light, men went to the altar and to war by way of a law of paradox. The Roman heart of that empire beat behind Greek words and Christian hymns. Power required heirs to breed its continuity, yet the palace required guardians who would not breed. Eunuchs were permitted where other men were not, the trusted presence in the queen's chamber, the safe hand at the latch at the emperor's bed. In a realm where the violence of politics often arrived as blindness rather than death, a man without sons could be entrusted to hold the realm without birthing a rival. Under the crescent and the call to prayer, in Istanbul's Topkapi, the Kislar, the chief black eunuch, kept quiet watch over the harem, the school of sultans, the engine of dynasties. The Ottomans inherited the world not by accident but by discipline and faith, and they built their palace as a universe in miniature. Gardens that taught patience, corridors that taught silence, rooms that taught men to attend to the breath of others. The black eunuchs came by way of the Red Sea and the Nile, torn from the life of the body so that the life of the court could be secured. Their power rose with the sultan's seclusion. The more remote the throne, the more present the man who controlled its access. In Delhi, under monsoon skies and towers that struck the horizon like spears, the Delhi Sultanate, and later the Mughals, took into their palaces and their armies men reshaped to serve the harem and the king's most private will. Sometimes the guardians were merely guardians, sometimes they were generals. In these lands, devotion wore steel, and mouths swore oaths that the body could no longer contradict. The title Khwaja Sara, Lord of the Servants, carried prestige that made and unmade kingdoms in whispers and in charges at dawn. In Cairo and Fustat, under the Mamluks and the Ikhshidids, a black eunuch would one day rule the Nile with a pen as sharp as any scimitar. In Damascus, Baghdad, and Samarra, the Abbasids installed eunuchs in the shadowed offices where worlds are exchanged, palace, treasury, the royal apartment, because the caliphate's splendor needed a seamstress's hand and a jailer's gaze to hold it together.
No single doctrine creates them. Necessity does. Religion condones and condemns in equal measure. Some jurists see in them protection for the sanctity of the harem, others see a violation of the natural order. Rumor says they are safe because they lack the hungers that drive other men. History replies that hunger merely changes shape. Lust becomes ambition. Paternity becomes patronage. Desire for legacy becomes desire for legend. They live in the places other men are not allowed, next to curtains, behind screens, beyond doors. The great religions understand the power of thresholds, between nave and sanctuary, between courtyard and chamber, between the underworld and the world of breath. And in those in-between spaces, a new kind of official grows. The eunuch is a symbol of trust, a hand that holds the keys without threatening the family line. He is also a symbol of fear, a reminder that the body can be rewritten by decree. In some places, the knife is an act of devotion. A boy taken to temple so that he may serve a god with a body unencumbered by the weight of begetting. In others, it is an act of commerce or of conquest, a debt paid by a family for survival or a punishment inflicted upon captives to make them valuable in a market that prized nearness over manhood. The rules that govern their lives are sharp as the instrument that made them. In China's Ming dynasty, an institution grew inside the institution, the Eastern Depot, a secret police run by eunuchs whose loyalty was to the emperor alone. Its memos were as lethal as knives. Its informants listened at doors that did not exist. In Byzantium, eunuchs became masters of ceremonies whose choreography of entrances and genuflections could bolster a dynasty or isolate it to death. The parakoimonos, the one who sleeps beside, had his ear to the night, the literal keeper of the bedchamber, a steward of access who could stage a coup by arranging a dawn that did not include the emperor's breath. The lives of these men are wrapped in silences that history has mistaken for emptiness. They were sometimes poor boys, sold by parents who thought they were buying them a sort of immortality. They were sometimes the sons of enemies, trimmed like hedges into the service of the victor. They were sometimes volunteers, believing that by stepping away from the inheritance of the flesh, they could inherit something larger, a nearness to the center of the world. In the accounts of travelers, they are shadows with keys. In the diaries of queens, they are confidants and confessors. In the edicts of kings, they are tools and scapegoats. In the poetry of the powerless, they are monsters who have forgotten they were once human. The world in which they move is thick with ritual, because ritual is how power tells itself it will never die. The smell of frankincense and aloes in the Ottoman corridors, the cold iron of Byzantine door bars that lift without a sound when the right hand is on them, the wax and vermilion in Chinese offices where seals fall like small suns upon paper, the wet musk of monsoon wood in Delhi where the sound of rain teaches men how to wait. These are the elements of the empire no map shows. Sound and scent, shadows and surfaces polished like mirrors. A language of gestures that means more than any proclamation. And yet, for all their difference, the palaces of the world share a single understanding, that the king is not a man, but an office, and that the office requires a guardian who has no lineage of his own. In that vacancy, power builds its nest. The result is a caste across centuries and continents, a hidden commonwealth of those who have been unmade to be made indispensable.
Begin in the east, where the sea is a story the land tells itself every dawn. The Ming emperor rises into ritual, a ladder of bows and prostrations, a liturgy that makes his body a planet for the court to orbit. He does not open his own doors. The man who does has no beard. His voice is soft and sharp, like a flute carved from bone. He was born poor, became a page, and in time learned that the emperor's day is a series of locks that only he and a few others know how to turn. His name is Zheng He, in the memory of sailors, though the sea they sailed had a dozen names. He is a eunuch, and he bears titles like sails, full of wind, Grand Director, Admiral of the Western Oceans. The boy from Yinnan rose into the inner sanctum and then beyond it, sent with a fleet as if to balance the world. Treasure ships taller than palaces, hulls like moving cities, red silk streaming from masts that made the wind itself kneel. He moves through the palace as though it is a harbour. He moves through the harbours of the Indian Ocean as though they are annexes of the throne room. He brings back giraffes and rumours of the edge of the world. He brings back ambassadors who kneel and present tokens that are as much obedience as ornament. In him, the promise of the eunuch's role, unsexual, pure, obedient, expands into a new kind of power, a diplomacy of awe. At night, in the cabin of his flagship, there is a small altar to a star. Zheng He lays his palm upon the map, feels the bumps of islands under his skin, and thinks of the boy he was, taken, emptied, and refilled with purpose. There is sorrow that smells of salt. There is also a kind of joy, the joy of being indispensable. He writes reports in an elegant hand for an emperor whose face he has learned to read better than any chart. He is an instrument, finely tuned, whose music changes the tone of an entire age. Elsewhere in the same century, another eunuch learns to command a different ocean,
the sea of secrets. Wei Zhongxian moves like an echo through the labyrinth of the forbidden city. His eyes are careful and his hands are never empty of work. He begins as a servant and becomes the wind behind an empress dowager's veil, the force that lifts papers and lowers heads. He commands the Eastern Depot, whose name is a threat and a promise. The Emperor Tianqi, more comfortable with carpentry than the calculus of governance, sits building toys while the affairs of state build storms. We build something too, a system of fear that hums throughout the provinces and returns to him like a river poured into a single cup. Scholars write dissent on their skins, and it shows in their eyes when they see him coming. Governors taste iron when his seal meets their orders. Priests and poets cough when they speak his name. Shrines to him blossom like fungus, a grotesque bloom of supplication and terror. He is the negative of a saint, a man who teaches the nation how to fear by collecting its fear and spending it with skill. He knows where to place pressure to break bones without breaking the skin. He has no son to inherit his power, but he has a disciple's zeal for building a machine that can run even when he sleeps. He does not sleep much.
Between these two men lies a continent of other lives, some glorious, some grotesque, all shaped by the same initial wound. Cross the deserts and the mountains and enter another palace. Hagia Sophia shadow lies long across a city that calls itself the Queen of Cities, and in the palace nearby sunlight breaks into gold on mosaic and silk. The emperor is not always strong, men often are. The Parakoimomenos, the keeper of the imperial bedchamber, waits in a room where the air smells of laurel and oil. His name is Basil Lekapenos, son of an emperor and a slave, blinded, or according to some, unmade, to make him safe. He learns to make safety into leverage. His office is a pair of eyes that belong to the throne, a pair of hands that handle the documents that decide who breathes and who drowns. He orchestrates audiences. He choreographs ambition. He becomes rich with a richness rare even for emperors, not because he steals, but because men who cannot understand a power without children assume wealth is what men like him desire. He does desire it, but not as end. It is a means of feeding the web he spins, the web whose center is the emperor's bed. He will watch emperors rise and emperors fall. He will help them, gently, to both. A century earlier, before Basil, the eunuch Narses, thin and old, marched west with a mind like a drawn blade. He is 60 or older. The body resists war at that age, but the mind finds in it a kind of clarity. He buys Italian loyalties with Byzantine gold, and where gold fails he uses cunning, and where cunning fails he uses patience. He does not lust for the throne, which is why he may seize cities. He is not a father, which is why thousands of men call him commander. He moves troops like a bishop moves a host, with solemnity and precision, making his faith manifest in the arrangements of bodies. Now listen for the call to prayer. In Istanbul, under domes that gather both sky and sound, the Kislar keeps the keys to the Sultan's most private world. He is a black man from lands the Sultan has never seen, the Nile's higher waters, kingdoms where the river is a string of green beads in a necklace of gold sand. His name is Haji Bashir in an age when empire has learned to call itself eternal. He controls endowments that feed scholars and mosques from Damascus to Mecca. He oversees the caravan to the holy cities, a river of piety that cannot be allowed to spill. He whispers to the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, whose gaze can still the palace like a hand stilling a pond. He is a servant, for so says the word. He is also an axis. At night he prays, not for power, for steadiness. The palace is a wheel. Those who cling to its rim are thrown. He has learned to stand near the hub. He fears hunger in the streets beyond the walls more than he fears the anger of a prince born too beautiful for patience. He has seen boys whipped into sultans and knows the marks never quite fade. He has seen girls made into instruments for the choir of dynasty and knows some songs can only be sung in tears.
He remembers a mother whose voice called him by a name no one knows here. On the day he dies, a fountain in Cairo runs clear and cold, and men say that's his gift, and women say his hands were clever. And scholars write in the small, careful lines of endowment charters the numbers that will keep the poor alive one more winter. Travel south and east, to the Nile 1,000 years earlier. Abul Misk Kafur steps into the role of a regent, as if it were a suit he had been measured for since birth. He was born a slave in Nubia, bought and trained in the court of Ibn Tulun's heirs, rises like a date palm given water. He is a eunuch, yes. He is also an administrator whose competence is a form of mercy. He knows the rhythm of the Nile as he knows the rhythm of the market, and in the swing of those two pendulums he keeps Egypt steady in an age that favors storms. He composes poetry and has poetry composed to him, though he cannot quite keep from flinching when a word tolls against the fact of his body. He rules because others cannot. He rules because someone must.
The monsoon pauses over Delhi and then advances. Now the narrow alleys of the palace quarter fill with the smell of wet rose and iron. Malik Kafur, black-eyed, beautiful, castrated in childhood, carries a sword that makes bells ring in temples far to the south. He rider leads armies into lands of teak and granite, returns with caravans of treasure and captives and gods folded in cloth. He returns with a legend, a eunuch who conquered kings. Alauddin Khalji listens to him more closely than to other generals, not because of the kings Kafur defeated, but because of the king Kafur does not aspire to be. There is love in their alliance, of a kind, or there is at least recognition. They build a space between them that is both throne and battlefield. It will not last. Such spaces never do. But when men speak of him, their words carry the smell of rain and the sound of silver falling on stone. A world away in Joseon, which we will visit only briefly because our ship is almost overfull, the king's household is kept by men whose names do not survive their service. They are eunuchs and scribes, caretakers of brushes, guardians of rooms where women wait for orders and boys learn how to bow. Their power is not an imperial tide, it is a pool, dark and still, where the moon shivers. A king leans over it and thinks of men in other courts he will never see, and he wonders if all kings breathe the same when they sleep. When you walk this long corridor of history, you begin to hear the same sounds repeat. The rustle of silk and paper, the clink of keys, the sudden absence of sound when a man enters a room he ought not to be in. We move through the palaces like smoke and look for what smoke reveals, the outline of what is burning. There is a scandal at the center of our story, and it is not the knife. It is the recognition that power is never so careful as when it places itself in the hands of those it will not allow to have sons. The eunuch is the perfect confidant because he has no heirs to be tempted by a whisper of inheritance. He is also the perfect scapegoat because the story does not have to continue through him. He is erased loudly when it suits a new reign. He is exalted silently when a reign needs to stand. Imagine now a night of knives in the hidden city. Wei Zhongxian statues flicker in torchlight as young men kick them down. The emperor is dead. The wind has changed. The eunuch reads the weather of faces with a speed born of having once been a boy who survived by reading weather. He decides to write his last order upon himself. By the time his enemies come, he is gone the way men like him know how to go, quietly, without the courtesy of letting those who hated him throw the rope. The next day, the streets sniff at their new air and pronounce it clean. It is not cleaner. It is merely unfamiliar. Another night, another empire.
Basil Lecapenos stands in a chamber where he has stood 1,000 times, and the light is wrong. The emperor is different, or the emperor's lover is different, or the emperor's impatience has finally worked its slow blade free. Basil is exiled. He leaves with a quiet that presages a famine. In the city, men say he was too powerful. They complain that the sun is too bright and are grateful when dusk arrives. They do not see that they must now govern their hunger without the man who taught them how.
Elsewhere, the Kislar tastes his own mortality in a persistent cough and signs papers that will outlive him by 100 years. Foundations and fountains, orphanages and schools. He cannot be a father, he chooses to be a flood. The core story is not one story, it is many, an archipelago of rooms lit by small lamps. In some of them, a boy is being told a secret he must keep until he dies. In some of them, a man is placing his hand upon a latch that will change the map. In some of them, an emperor is sleeping, in some waking, in some dying. And always, always, a eunuch is at the edge of the bed, listening to the breath that rules the world. We return to Zheng He because he is a calmer of seas and because the sea pauses to admire him. His fleet dwindles. Emperors change, and with them the weather. Bureaucrats decide the world is large enough without his sails. He goes home. He dies. Paper shadows replace ships. A wall replaces the horizon. The eunuch admiral returns to water as all men do. His sailors tell his stories in tea shops with the air of men talking about a god who wandered among them. In the Talus, someone wipes his name from a list with a careful brush. It is the brush's job to remember. It is the brush's job to forget. And we must speak briefly of more private lives, because not all power is palatial. A woman in the harem goes into labor, and the Kislar times his breathing with hers as if he could bear the child by proxy. He cannot. The boy is born and will one day be a prince, and then perhaps a sultan. He will remember the man with the keys before he remembers his father. In a courtyard in Chang'an, a poet drinks too much and insults a eunuch. The next day, he writes an apology that tastes of ashes and means it. In a Byzantine chapel, an acolyte lights a candle for a steward he never met because someone told him it is the proper thing to do for a dead man who kept the roof from falling and the wolves from the door. The lives of kings are known. The lives of those who kept them alive are smudges at the edges of illuminated manuscripts. But sometimes the light shifts, and the marginalia becomes the story. A courtier's letter preserved in damp, a line in a chronicle that lingers on a face otherwise unrecorded, a rumor that refuses to die because it admits the truth more gracefully than any document. From these, the empire of the unmade is revealed. Not a nation on a map, but a dynasty of offices connecting palaces like beads on a string.
What a palace builds, a palace may bury. The very same instrument that made eunuchs useful, severance, made them disposable. And so their power coils into tragedies that recur like seasons, purges like winter, exiles like autumn, sudden springs of favor, and the long, humid summers of unspoken fear. In China, the pendulum swings with a force that shatters tables. The scholar gentry and the eunuchs are two lungs in a chest that too often forgets how to breathe. The Eastern depot's shadow grows long until it covers even its own footsteps. When a new emperor arrives, breathing the airs of moral restoration, the pendulum returns. The eunuchs are imprisoned, interrogated, banished. Their palaces of influence collapse as swiftly as stalls in a market at dusk. They are buried with their records, as if secrecy were a kind of grave good. Wei Zhongshen's statues fall, and with them the careful architecture of fear he erected, a house that held back a storm that in his absence roars into the court. Some eunuchs are skinned in poems rather than in public squares. Satire is a slow knife that rusts the reputation until it dissolves in laughter, and in China the laughter outlives its subjects. Yet the bodies were real. Not every purge ends in exile. Some end in ropes, in cold stones, in the splintering of the neck upon the edge of a step. The verb the chroniclers use is the same verb they use for peasants and princes alike, to extinguish, as if lives are candles and the world is a draughty template. In Byzantium, the poetic punishment is not death, but removal from the circle of light. Basil Lakapenos is sent away to a monastery, his wealth scattered, his contacts severed, his office unmoored. He is not blinded because he has already been made safe. His fate is to watch the palace breathe without him, a kind of torture unique to those who have once been the palace's lungs. Other eunuchs are physically punished, the knife's work augmented by the iron because the state needs to show a body that bears the crime in its shape. They are tonsured, shut behind cloistered walls that cannot mute the memory of ceremony. The hymns use different words from the imperial oaths, but the melody is close enough to cut. In Istanbul, the Kislar Ağa falls as discreetly as he once rose. A new sultan, doubting an old favor, sends a bowstring and 2 men who have never failed. The room is quiet afterwards. The carpets drink the sound. The endowment charters remain. The water keeps running in the fountains he founded. Children who drink there never learn the name of the man who bought them clean mouths. In time, a new chief arrives, and the keys jingle with the same authority in a different hand. The palace is a creature that renews itself by consuming its previous skin. In Delhi, Malik Kafur's life ends in a room that once smelled of victory. The Sultan's death unravels the bonds that had held ambition in its sheath. Princes bite like jackals, generals cough up their loyalty and spit it into the gutter. Kafur is too visible to survive, too powerful to be permitted the dignity of old age. The chroniclers differ. Some say he grasped for a regency and met iron. Some say he tried to make a child king and tripped upon a plot. All agree on the noise. It was not quiet. In such endings, there is a lesson the palace teaches itself, that the instrument must be unmade before it learns to be an arm.
The darkest consequences do not belong to the powerful alone. They adhere to the nameless. The boys made into tools, the voices lowered into service, the jars with their sealed secrets, the bodies that carried the weight of a kind of holiness and a kind of crime. They die in the small rooms of servants, in the outbuildings of palaces, in the temple annex. They leave behind rings of keys and small purses filled with careful coins, and sometimes a letter that says, in a script that refuses to shake, "Bury me where the plum blossoms fall." There is tragedy not only in endings, but in afterwards. When dynasties fall, the chronicles written by the triumphant are full of necessary monsters. Eunuchs fill that role perfectly. When the Eastern Han collapses, the 10 attendants, Zhang Rang and his fellows, are painted in strokes so black they deposit soot on the fingers. They are avarice given faces, lust without sex, greed without heirs. Jin Hen, the general who raised the blade against them, is murdered. His death opens the door to chaos. Dong Zhuo comes, and with him civil war. The price of filling a world with demons is that one day demons find you. But if you read between the lines with a lighted mind, you find the mundane idiocy of power. Men hoarding favor, men miscounting grudges, men exhausted by the work of being always afraid. A palace does not forget easily, but it forgets deliberately. After the eunuchs fall, the palace learns to pretend it never needed them. It scrubs their names from plaques and polishes their footprints from the threshold stones. A generation later, Doors stick again, secrets go astray, the court's breath grows ragged, and so boys are sent to be remade, and a generation after that, the keys return to the same old ring, the same old sound of authority walking toward the bedchamber in the night. Among the darkest fruits of their empire is loneliness, a loneliness that does not perish in the poems or in the stones. A man who holds the confidence of a king holds his isolation like a sacrament. The women of the harem trust the Kislar with their bodies and their secrets. None can share his winter. The emperor's eunuch may stand close enough to count the notes of the imperial breath. He will never be touched by a hand that is not paying him. The Perikoimonos knows everyone's sleep. No one knows his dreams. And then there are the atrocities from which history does not draw a veil. The act of castration itself, the blood that is both punishment and sacrament, done with knives in rooms that stink of herbs and fear. For some, it is a mark of devotion. For many, it is a mark on the ledger of conquest and class. The child does not understand the liturgy that will redefine him. The men who wield the blades understand money. Somewhere, in the same century, a farmer's son dies on a field, nameless, pierced by a spear. There are 1,000 ways to be made into an instrument. Only some of them smell of incense. In this catalogue of consequences, we must account also for the curses that cling to reputations like burrs. To be a eunuch is to be accused in some histories of poisoning women with suspicion and men with fear. To be a eunuch is to be said to have murdered the state. It is convenient. It absolves the kings, the ministers, the armies, the gods. It makes a tidy story for which the knife is both cause and conclusion. But the world is rarely tidy. Where one eunuch ruled with a hidden blade, another saved a child king's life by standing between him and an uncle's anger. Where one stole, another endowed. Mosques, schools, wells, bridges. Where one's face turned up in nightmares, another's name was murmured with relief in the sick rooms of the poor. The shadows the eunuchs cast are shaped by torches men hold for their own purposes. Walk through that light carefully. Learn to see the hands that hold the flame.
History inhales and exhales, and in that rhythm there are rooms where the air still remembers these men. In Beijing, if you put your ear to the lacquer, you can hear the hush of slippers and the click of a seal. In Istanbul, if you stand in the second court very early, the stones still hold a coolness that feels like the absence of footsteps, a negative image of motion. In Cairo, the fountains still pour water bought with money from hands that would not hold a child. In Ravenna and Rome, the mosaic's eyes seem to track a figure who moves behind the emperor, his face composed, his hands steady. In Delhi, the rain beats upon old fortifications and murmurs names that the wind would rather you not know. The legacy of eunuchs is a palimpsest, a scroll written upon, scraped and written upon again. Their enemies have left us one set of lines. The architecture has left us another. What remains is not only cautionary tale, but a study in the mechanics of proximity. Rulers learn, forget, and learn again that the one who controls the threshold controls the throne. Offices change names, palaces change styles, religions change texts. The physics of the door never changes. Our age is impatient with the knife. It prefers the scalpel of law, the needles of bureaucracy, the anesthesia of euphemism. We do not make new eunuchs in the old manner, not in the halls of power. We make them instead in the documents, in the rules that require men and women to amputate parts of themselves to serve, to surrender lineage for security, to exchange desire for constancy. The figure of the eunuch lingers then, not as a body, but as a position, the one who is trusted because he has placed something essential beyond use, the one who is feared because he has learned that other organs of power can be enlarged by the abdication of the obvious ones.
There are questions that remain unanswered because no one thought to ask them of those who could have answered. What did Zheng He think when he saw the African coast, recognizing in faces and in music a part of his empire's unseen heart? What did Basil dream the night after he arranged an emperor's wedding, when the music faded and the candles guttered? What prayer did Haji Bashir whisper when the caravan reached the first sight of Mecca's light along the plain? Did Wei Zhongxian ever stand alone in a room and feel the panic that comes to men who hold power on loan from someone else's breath? We will never know. And what history does not know, it dresses in myth. The unmade men become magicians in the stories told by those who feared them, poisoners, whisperers who could bend the spine of an empire by blowing upon a seal. In other stories, their absence is a blessing. Saints who renounced in order to serve, their bodies transformed into symbols of purity and dedication. Both myths demand too much and too little. The truth stands between. Ordinary men remade into extraordinary offices, whose pain did not cancel their competence, whose ambition did not cancel their need for tenderness, whose service did not cancel the damage done on the day a blade rewrote their lives. Their taboo persists. It is the echo of a room we will never enter. It is the ache around words we find ourselves avoiding. It is the hush in the voice of a guide in a museum who gestures toward an object no one mentions. A ring of keys, a ledger in a careful hand, a portrait in which a man's face is composed beyond reading. We have learned to be embarrassed by the old practicalities. We have also learned to miss the clarity that comes from naming the price of a thing.
At the end of the corridor, there is always a door. Behind the door is a bed. Upon the bed is a ruler, awake or asleep, dying or being born. Beside the bed is a man whose body is an argument and a peace treaty, a sacrifice and a calculation. If you listen very carefully in that room, you can hear the sound of a key turning, not in a lock, but in history. There is no keyhole. The door opens inward anyway, and we are permitted to look only long enough to learn this much. The empire of the unmade was never confined to one people or one crown. It was the great, secret architecture of power, a latticework of guardians whose shadows held up the light. The last lamp dims, the silk cools, the seal hardens, the night is deep, and the city breathes as quietly as it can. In the morning, the doors will open. Someone will stand beside them with keys that weigh less than they look, and if you listen closely enough to the iron as it meets the wood, you will hear the old empire declare itself, softly, as it always did, beyond maps and beneath words. They did not inherit, they did not beget. They were allowed to approach the sun, and they learned how to hold it without burning. The light that fell on their hands is gone now, but sometimes, through a crack in a closed door, it escapes, and you see it, and you understand why kingdoms are afraid of what they cannot name.